Hello and welcome to the CIP Roadmap Update webinar. My name is Michelson Buchanan, Manager Engineering and Security Integration. I'm joined by my colleagues Larry Collier, Darko Kovac, and Dan Goodlett. We'll be providing background for the CIP Roadmap initiative and a bit of a process overview. How did we go through the exercise? And then some insight on what we're seeing so far and next steps, if you will. So a little bit about the background of what's this all about. For 2025, NERC's work plan includes a priority to create a roadmap for ensuring the CIP standards provide baseline protection for an evolving risk environment. So what does that mean? A little bit more detail down below that. Evaluate the CIP standards against emerging cybersecurity and physical security risks, and create recommendations and a roadmap to address the gaps. So what does that mean? I mean, if you're going to do that, first you really have to give some thought to what the risks are, right? We can't just come up with an arbitrary list of risks. We really got to have a process for thinking that through and considering, what are the risks that we're comparing against, right? And then having a process for evaluating those risks, and then thinking through the mitigating activities that might result. So we really saw this very much as a risk management exercise, if you will, right? And really thinking big picture, taking an opportunity to step back to look at things from a broader perspective. Often we're evaluating SARS, standards authorization requests. If you're not familiar with them, that's one of our functions, right? And we're typically looking at those kind of materials in their own context, right? And we're bringing our experience and our judgment to that exercise, but really what this is all about is having a roadmap for just kind of thinking through where do we want to be in the future, and for example, how would any potential SARS fit with that roadmap and our vision of where we want to be going forward, and really big picture, what are the focus areas for us, right? How does quantum computing compare to AI-enabled malware? How do those two things line up against one another, and where should we focus our efforts? So that's what this is all about. Again, the approach, we really looked at it as a risk management exercise, and so we went through a process of identifying risks, right? And step one is to get everything on the board. Really get a list of risks. We used a survey initially. It was a pretty broad survey. We started at one point with around 70 risks and then narrowed that to 42 some odd risks, and sent out a survey to get feedback from industry on those risks. We asked them as well to give us a prioritization on those risks. So in that exercise, we're really looking for two things. Do we have the right stuff? Have we identified the right risks to even be considered as kind of a step one? And then as well, what are their thoughts on the prioritization of those risks? So we kind of used that survey in two related but distinct ways, right? And of course, when we were identifying risks, we leveraged all the resources that we had available to us, EISEC briefings, system materials, the ERO risk reliabilities report that's published. That was published this year in 25. We talked to the events team. We talked to standards to get their feedback. We talked to compliance assurance, and I think it's important to point out that we're really looking at this. We're trying not to sensationalize risks. Often risks can either be threat centric or they can be vulnerability centric. But we really try to think about risks look at all the elements of risks. The threat, the vulnerability, or the inverse of vulnerabilities being the controls. What's the control framework addressing the particular threat? And then what's the so what factor, right? What's the impact, right? If a particular risk doesn't have much of an impact, then there's not a lot of risk there, right? I'm probably not telling you anything that you haven't heard before, but it's easy to sensationalize things. You see that in the headlines a lot. So we really wanted to think it through and think about risks in their entirety as we went through the process. So we did that in our write-up and our materials as well. We provided examples, risk scenarios, if you will, to help folks understand exactly what we were referring to by the particular risk. So all that was provided in the survey materials and in other materials that we had sent out along the way. So we went through a process to assess the risks, and in doing so, we developed a framework, right? So how are we going to do that? What's the criteria? Larry's going to talk more about that, and how do we rank them? How do we it's quantitative and somewhat, I'd say more qualitative than quantitative, but we used how you might say qualitative methods to come up with quantitative figures. But Larry's going to share more about that whole process. And then at the end of the day, what are we going to do about those risks, right? What are the mitigating activities that might move the needle on each of those risks? So we really thought through big picture, what are the mitigating activities for each one, trying to be all inclusive. And then we gauged, if we've got a mitigating activity that's addressing multiple risks, maybe the top, 4 of the top 5, then obviously that's a bigger bang for the buck, so to speak. So you would consider prioritizing that mitigating activity over others, right? So that's kind of the way that we thought about it. So we're going to share more detail about that with you as well. Work products, right? So we developed, obviously we've got the survey results, that'll be an appendix in the report. Larry's got some high-level results to share with you. We've got the risk register, right? How did we enumerate the risks finally, and then how did we rank and grade them? What kind of scores did they get? And then we very much see that risk register as something that would exist in perpetuity, right? So we can use that as a tool in the future to kind of gauge risks. Where does this risk fit? If something pops up that's new, we're going to use the same method that we have to kind of rank that risk and then see where it fits. We've got the prioritized mitigating activities. You'll see that in the way of recommendations and kind of next steps in the report, and then of course the report itself that's going to pull it all together. A little bit about collaboration and communication. So we've got the core NERC team, if you will. So that's myself and Dan and Larry and Darko. We did a lot of the heavy lifting, if you will, a lot of the day-to-day activities, right? And then we pulled in 2 resources from each of the regions. So we have an ERO enterprise team that's also been collaborating with us, and as well EISAC. We were collaborating with the EISAC on about the same interval as the enterprise participants. So that was really good. It's always good to get feedback. And then as kind of the last ring out, we were using the RSTC as kind of a sounding board, the sites, SWG and SCS groups, security integration, the security working group, and the supply chain subcommittee as a sounding board, right, to have them look at our materials along the way. So as we went through each of those phases, as we identified risks, as we developed our methodology, we sent that out, usually did a briefing on it, but sent it out to get feedback on that. That's been really valuable, to get that feedback and have that input along the way. And I think it's worth pointing out that we didn't just rely on the industry survey, really looking at everything that we could and collaborating as much as we could to get as many ideas on the table and get as much feedback as we could. We were looking at, everything that had been published to date, and that was and to some extent being, as the ERO Reliability Risk Priorities Report was being developed, we were watching that progress, right? And looking at the reasoning and the rationale that was being used, and as well other things like the INSM study that we did not too long ago, and of course the LICRT report, the Low Impact Criteria Review that was done, and other materials. There was another kind of a standards review that was done not that long ago. We looked at all of those materials. We were watching everything that was happening with reference to FERC's activities and NOPRs or orders that were had been generated during the period. So all of that went into the work that we did. Many of you probably saw the survey, so just wanted to point out that it wasn't as simple as just taking the survey and then generating our results from that. It was rather more complex. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Larry to talk a little bit about the process.
Thanks, Michelson. So as Michelson said, we really were aiming for a risk-based methodology. Um, and in order to identify risk, we had to build a risk registry. In order to take that and run through an assessment, we needed an evaluation framework, one that was designed for industry level or enterprise level risk across the spectrum of varying risks that we have that we're dealing with. Um, Within that assessment, looking at to get residual risk, we also did a degree of a control gap analysis, which also served to fuel the development of our mitigating controls that we identified and led into our recommendations. Um, we wanted to make sure our mitigation development was focused on collaboration first activities with industry, and that they were going to be, as much as possible, offering focused on comprehensive risk reduction, getting the best bang for the buck. Next slide, please. So in building a risk registry, we first kind of had to just really throw the whole kitchen sink at it. We worked with the ISAC. We pulled from CISA reports, NERC alerts, industry reports coming out of the RSTC, the 2025 risk report, and really just everything that's often looked at. We had everything from traditional risks like traditional threat-based risks like supply chain, phishing, malware, compromise, but we also had emerging technologies like AI, right? And we identified that there's a need to roll up some of these things. For example, we identified that AI is often can be an aggravating factor for a lot of pre-existing threats, phishing notably. But also AI, we have to look at it from it being used as a service or resource supporting the BPS, and that could get compromised in that way. So it becomes its own standalone potential risk. We had everything from threats, as I mentioned, technologies, including systems like DERMS and EVSE that are used by emerging functions in the BPS distribution side in that case. But also entire categories of assets that could be compromised, like Category 2 IBRs. So we were working with a broad spectrum of different tiers of risk even. And so we had to define those, define scenarios around how they can impact the BPS, potentially just to create a common um, view of framing those risks so all reviewers and individuals involved in feedback in this process are on the same page. And that really is just concluded our initial list that we could take to industry. And that's where we stepped into the industry security risk survey. Next step, please. Next slide. Um, so we to the survey we submitted to industry, we wanted you guys to both rank the risk relatively. We didn't call out residual risk directly in the survey questionnaire, but we anticipated that effectively we were going to get the residual risk framing from industry respondents. And the reason is because that is residual risk as opposed to inherent risk is broadly what we all think and operate on a basis of day to day. Now, we also asked respondents to offer up in free form fields any additional risks that they felt weren't represented on the list, and just general feedback as well. The results were overwhelmingly very well aligned with where the security integration team was set internally, as well as with all the feedback that we led into our initial process. And so that list came back very well. Some of the feedback was with the fatigue. There were quite a number of initial risks that we asked industry to rank in the initial survey. And so based on that, we took that feedback and pared down some of the final list. Next step, please. So this is the relative ranking order that we got back from the survey. We also cut down 12 or so of the risks that were originally on the list. Given both internally and I think from the feedback, we saw that there's just a number of risks that fell off in residual risk and their potential likelihood or impact to the grid. Even pre-assessment, that was pretty clear to us. Anything that we took off, we are keeping for internal tracking and future monitoring of those items and the NERC team. But this got us down to a much lower list. Just a couple call outs here that are interesting. Of course, a lot of the traditional threats are up on the top of the list, even though several of them may already have a number of pre-existing solid mitigations in the NERC CIP standards. But we also have physical security and weaponization of drones, which we had called out as a specific line item, separate from physical attacks. Both of those made it into the upper half of the list, which was an interesting item. And then additionally, some of the more what we call topic du jour risks that are, papers are being written within the RCTC and have been written, and we're of course monitoring, like DR aggregators, EVSC, and even Category 2. They all fell in the bottom half, right? So kind of interesting. And if we're going to the next slide, one of the things that we also wanted to do with the survey, looking at the results, is assess the distribution of the answers by the respondents to get a sense of industry's consensus or even confidence around the answers and the relative ranking that was provided back to us. And we did see that there was overwhelmingly a very solid, close clustering of answers. So that gives a sense that there is solid consensus and confidence. All right, next up, please. So with essentially exiting the survey and the final culling of the risk list gave us our risk registry, which we then needed to step into assessing. In order to do that, we had to build a risk evaluation framework, as I previously mentioned. Now, we wanted something that could essentially facilitate a structured process for what is very much a research informing and brainstorm discussion based process. So we went with something with a quantitative scoring, a formal formula based on likelihood and impact, mitigated on each side of that equation by a controls-based assessment against NERC CIP, controls efficacy implemented and such in a way that impact likelihood or impact. But ultimately, we recognize that it is still a qualitative assessment. We developed definitions for our criteria, the factors that we used to assess those criteria for each risk individually, and of course, we've actually built rubrics. So this could essentially across the team and with all reviewers and associated individuals giving feedback, it creates something more consistent and again aligning expectations so that we can all look at these each risk in the same manner, hopefully. So we had likelihood criteria like historical precedent, looking at things like where these risks have manifested in the past, but also analogous sectors, including the broad cybersecurity community, and just kind of weighted that in with our professional judgment. But analogous sectors like water and gas. We looked at TTPs, reports from EISAC, CISA, even the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and the impact side of the equation is a little bit more tricky. Of course, many discussions in the industry when doing risk assessment kind of have to sort through that problem. So we kind of went with a combination of impact criteria. The first one being, what is the type of the scope of impact? Is it a loss of monitoring or control, loss of control, even manipulation of control, and in some cases damage or destruction of actual assets. And then we step into severity. Um, how wide is a single individual attack in its potential impact to the grid from a single the footprint of a single entity to maybe a increased area up to like an RC footprint. And then thirdly, we looked at for each individual risk, what is the potential for coordinated or distributed attack across their commonality of infrastructure or services or configuration. And this is kind of leaning into what we learned since the LICRT report, which is what is the potential for for aggregation in the impact to the grid. And so those three impact factors together really form the core of how we were looking at that side of the risk equation. And as I said, um, risk mitigation was evaluated on the basis of the efficacy of the controls and the implementation across the industry. However, for our framework, we identified, we were working with some constraints. We had to be mindful of those. Obviously, we have data gaps in our ability to understand the full breadth of implementation of these of existing controls throughout the industry because of broad types of sizes of organizations and different types of entities, different configurations, different implementations of CIP requirements, as well as recognizing that we're working with broad threat actors and impacts, and just had to make this risk assessment in a way that's as uniform in its approach for an industry size assessment. And additionally, with some of the rubrics that we designed, we had to use our professional judgment in how we applied those rubrics in sometimes an abstract way for some of the particular outlier risks that don't easily conform, like regulatory lag, for example. How does, what are the TTPs associated with regulatory lag? So we had to work within those constraints as best we could. But predominantly, the evaluation framework, when we stepped into performing our assessment, it accomplished what we were aiming for. And that led us into mitigations. Next slide, please. So our development of mitigations, using the control gap analysis that we already started in order to answer and score for mitigations within the evaluation framework. That control gap analysis continued as we began identifying controls that could potentially mitigate each risk that we went line by line through. We were identifying potential control enhancements, extensions of scope, applicable scope, and even new purpose-built controls. We were utilizing and leaning into external frameworks like NIST, 853 and 882 and others, both for validation and inspiration for those potential control opportunities. We recognized and considered regulatory activities that are ongoing that may already be moving the needle on residual risk, including standards projects, any outstanding SARs, FERC orders, and even guideline development that's already underway or recently concluding under the RSTC. At the beginning stages of this, we really wanted to make sure that we were not taking anything off the table when we were just looking at potential mitigation. So we kind of took a controls first mindset to not limit the creative exploration and getting too deep into the limitations of kind of taking a very compliance-minded mindset or the implementation constraints, resource constraints that we often need to step into when we're talking about mitigation. So we first kind of put those aside so we could be open-minded to the potential controls, and then we had to filter afterwards, walking through those exercises. Now we ended up with a individual risk to mitigated controls kind of list But that's not where it stops, right? Because in reality, in the real world, we look for cost benefit basis of applying mitigations, right? We want mitigative controls that are as comprehensive in their coverage to the spectrum of risk as possible. That are, and so to that end, we basically created a matrix mapping, a tool that, as you see on the screen currently, taking the controls and mapping them across the risk. So we took the mitigative controls we identified, and now we can see them comprehensively where their coverage is across the spectrum of risk, and also where the outliers to that are in the orange, for example, the risks that don't benefit from broad coverage and might need something more specific, tailored mitigations for those risks that are high priority. We, of course, as I said, we did go through and take a practical lens for that cost-benefit realism, right-size application, considering implementation restraints and resource restraints to make sure the controls we've identified and where we might see them fit are as grounded as possible. And with that, I'll hand it over to Darko, who will go through insights gained from this process.
Thank you, Larry. The next thing is going to be insights, basic cyber hygiene. And you might say to yourself, like, I'm doing the cyber hygiene already. What else is to do there? And there is more than that. So cyber hygiene is giving you that opportunity to have control over your system. If you don't have it, somebody else will. If somebody else has control over your system, anything is possible, and you might not like it. So what is a cyber hygiene? Cyber hygiene are the minimum requirements that industry shall take to prevent or minimize consequences of cyber attacks. The strongest mitigation against nearly every major cyber risk facing the BPS stem from the consistent implementation of basic, modern cyber hygiene controls. I got 5 of them that I'm going to be talking about. And the first one is patching. Why is the patching important? Patching is the part that separates the vulnerability from a solid system. Many times in history it happened that if you don't patch something, somebody else can get into it because there is something, that one door that was left open and somebody was able to exploit it. The next thing you know, you're hacked. The next thing you know, you have no control over your system. The next one is segmentation. There are 2 types of companies. The companies that know they have somebody in it and the ones that don't. In both cases, you want to segment your network. You don't want to let whoever is in it to freely roam on that attack surface. By segmentation, you're limiting that attack surface. You're making it much harder for whoever is inside to get to whatever they want to do. And hopefully they're going to move to something else or somebody else. Another big one is the access control. This is one of those least privilege. When you provision somebody an access, ask yourself 2 questions. Does this person need it? And for how long? Once that how long expires, remove it. Put it back as it was. Because the more you have it and is not used, somebody else might use it. And you might get hacked. And that is a risk. Next one is on the asset inventory. And this actually should be the first one. You cannot defend something unless you know what you're defending. So when you got all the assets enumerated, indexed, you know where they're at. You know what they do. You also know their end of life. And you can also patch them. And you can protect them better. This way, you're in control. And lastly, I have low impact of CIP3. CIP3 covers the low impact assets. And you might think like, well, everything is in it. Well, not so much. You got much more protection given in the medium level and a high level assets that are not covered in the CIP3. So you might think about, is there anything I can do from CIP3 that I need to increase it to protect my system better? Next slide, please. The next insight is on unencrypted public network usage. This is one of those things like the best thing to do is to have your own private network. However, that is not always possible. Sometimes your assets are separated by hundreds of miles, and to run your own private network might be cost prohibitive. So the next best thing is to get it from somebody else. But like everything else in life, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. So what are the trade-offs? That traffic might be unencrypted. If it's unencrypted, whoever breaks inside can see what's going on, and you might not like it because they might either read what you got or they might insert some of the set commands or status changes that you might not like at that time. So how do you get it? You go to either to contract or to lease it from a third party, meaning you're going to be still paying for it, you're going to be not in control over it, and you're going to be most likely sharing with somebody else. And that somebody else are the other users. And those other users, they might exceed their bandwidth. Once that happens, that network becomes saturated, and you might not be able to get your information in time. And you might not be able to get it as you wanted to get it. This also leads it to the point which I mentioned briefly. You have no control over it. You don't control that communication anymore. Now this is up to communication network provider. And what they do, if they got any type of an issue, they might not even answer it when you call them frantically, stating that your system is down because they are working on it. And most likely you're going to be hearing it. We're going to let you know once the system is up. In the meantime, your connection is gone. It doesn't work. All this is being exploited right now. You probably heard of Salt Typhoon. It's one of those typhoon families that are specifically attacking electrical industry. Well, Salt Typhoon is attacking communication industry. And this is one of the reasons why. Because they want to get into communication part. They're looking for that weakest link. And once they find it, they're going to exploit it as much as they can. And that is all for me. I'm going to turn you to Dan now.
All right. Thank you, Mikeson, Larry, and Darko. Before I continue here, I just want to reiterate the things that Mikeson and Larry touched on, which is the collaborative and comprehensive nature of this work, the various process inputs, opinions received, the subject matter expertise from the ERO and the ERO enterprise, and the various RSTC groups as well as industry. So I just want to say thank you to those who provided the input to our efforts. So it might be a tad bit cliche at this point, but I think we all are aware of the changes that the grid system has been undergoing over the past 10 to 15 years. Obviously, it's evolving, and it's probably going to be a perpetual state from this point forward. Some of those, but not all those key drivers. We have IBRs, inverter-based resources, grid forming versus not, DER aggregators, electric vehicle supply equipment, the enablement of cloud operations through efforts like 2023-09 standard drafting team and previous efforts in adjusting CIP 4 and CIP 11 to allow for BCSI to be stored in the cloud. We have generation retirement constraints that we're dealing with, and of course, new policies that the administration is putting forth. So it's not just those, but there are other factors, including the variable nature of the generation that we see coming online, as well as the number of entities that are participating in the system and the number of assets being managed. It has continued to grow. And of course, the demand forecasts are not showing any lessening of that trend. So it's with this backdrop that we undertake the evaluation of the CIP standards' ability to serve as the baseline security controls necessary to protect the reliability and security of the grid, and that's the effort that we're involved in here. So recent NERC data collections, including Section 800 data requests, a recent Level 2 NERC alert regarding cross-border remote access, as well as the report that Michelson mentioned, our internal network security monitoring report that NERC filed with FERC in 2024. All these evidence that generation assets on the grid today and a large portion of the new generation resources coming online possess remote access capabilities into their systems, both for internal usage and with non-registered third parties that provide operational support or maintenance or monitoring or some combination of those. So the fact of the matter is that low-impact BES cyber systems make up approximately 75% of our assets, and that does not include the sub-BES Category 2 IBRs that are coming online as of March of next year, I believe. And as I said, they heavily rely operationally on remote access capabilities, so that's just a fact of the matter. The Low Impact Criteria Review Team report, or the LICRT, as was mentioned a couple times, highlighted that the risk of coordinated attack at these less defended assets is real and it exists. So, all these factors represent risk to the reliability and security of the grid. FERC's recent NOPR proposing to approve CIP 3-11 changes highlighted that they are also still concerned with risk posed by potential coordinated or other styles of attack against low impact assets. We have the large loads, we have DR aggregators, EVSE, they all represent growing attack vectors of BPS risk exposure, and some of these domains may be outside of currently enforceable NERC CIP standards at present. Rather than this being a doomsday signal or something of that sort, they're just realities that we have to deal with, and they illustrate that as the grid evolves and the security risks that threaten the reliability and security of the grid change, we need to make sure that the CIP standards keep pace with that level of change, and it should be a call to industry to action. Next slide, please. All right, so this is regarding multi-factor authentication. We've had, a myriad of examples of remote access abuse, stolen credentials, primarily through not having multi-factor authentication, making those attacks successful. Ukrainian attacks with Black Energy and crash override, the Colonial Pipeline incident, of course. That CISA has time and time again repeatedly put out advisories, breaking down attacks, showing how the attack chain manifested, and time again, MFA could have mitigated these types of successful compromises. You can see here on screen some quotes from various CISA alerts that they have put out over the years. So we know that phishing is the #1 threat vector into IT systems, and that stolen credentials are often the mechanism for facilitating those breaches. As such, MFA remains one of the most effective and broadly applicable defenses against unauthorized access through stolen credentials. And consistent application of MFA is always identified as a control that directly reduces the likelihood of potential impact of those compromises across many of the evaluated risks in our NERC risk registry that Larry described. So while we have been improving across the board, particularly in low impact CIP3 controls, the latest revisions to CIP 3-11, carrying some extra controls around vendor access, they fall short of recommending multi-factor authentication controls. Again, I'll point back to the FERC recent NOPR on CIP 3-11 and highlight that they are continuing to be concerned over the risks that is posed through attacks on these less well-defended bad cyber systems. Lastly, I'll just reiterate the NERC INSM study also pointed out that multi-factor authentication is a prime candidate for continuing the evolution of the minimum security controls through NERC CIP standards. Next slide, please. So as Larry mentioned, the physical security bubble to the top. The physical security risk environment, it continues to evolve just like our grid, and adversaries continue to target the electric grid assets. We have a lot of factors here in this domain, the oftentimes remote nature and unmanned nature of these facilities. Of course, drones playing a big factor here in this domain as well, given the use of them in the Ukrainian war. Theft remains a top domain of attack that is used against these assets, and of course, always, as with everything, costs play a big role. So even despite the increased geopolitical threat environment impacting critical infrastructures around the world, fortunately, the frequency of incidents causing operational impacts remains relatively low. EISAC has some non-public data around this, and they've been tracking these trends for years. So if you'd like to see any of that TLP Amber Plus strict classified data, you need to be a member of the EISAC, and I hope everyone listening to this is, and if not, please reach out and connect with them online. One large reason why the EISAC is able to have this data and perform this trend analysis is that it's in large part due to the increase in voluntary information sharing by EISAC members. So it's imperative on us to get more membership and also facilitate more sharing. Sometimes I hear folks in their physical security discussions worrying about EISAC being inundated with, quote, data they don't need or something of that nature, right? And I say The more, the better. The EISAC is totally capable and competent in being able to filter data and do these kinds of analysis, but they need the data to do it. So that's just a little bit of foot stomp for the EISAC, as Matt Duncan likes to say. So again, we highly encourage this data sharing, and if not already, please become a member of the EISAC. However, given the changes in the war tactics that's been highlighted in the Ukraine-Russian war through the massive expansion of drone usage, the fact that physical security, and in particular drone security, also potentially coupled with some FAA changes and rules, it just reinforces the fact that physical security remains a topic that industry should keep its focus on. What this looks like, maybe guidance is sufficient, or potentially scoping in more assets to CIP 14 style assessments, or potentially raising the minimum control bar for low impact or sub-low impact physical security are some of the options on the table. And so we just need to make sure that this is a category that we continue to pay attention to, as it warrants continued focus and further evaluations. The next slide, I'll throw it to Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan and Larry and Darko. I might point out that, at the top of the deck, I mentioned that there were essentially 4 work products, right? The survey, the risk register, the prioritized mitigating activities recommendations would all be part of the report. And what you don't see there are SARs, right? So we're not going to exit this process with attached SARs ready to go to the standards committee. We will have recommendations for changes in the CIP standards, or maybe enhancements, right? That just makes sense, but that's not the only lever we can pull. We as well will be making recommendations, other recommendations. There's things we can do in addition to or other than modifying the CIP standards. So we're going to include that as well. And if we've got any recommendations to modify the CIP standards, we're going to do that through collaboration with industry. That's our plan and our commitment. So next steps, 5 November, we're going to review a preliminary draft of the CIP roadmap report with our ERO participants, get some feedback as well, get feedback from our NERC staff, do additional reviews. We've been doing reviews with these teams along the way, but this is going to be kind of the next iteration of that. 6th of November, we'll have the webinar FAQ available. And mid-November, we're going to review a preliminary draft of the CIP roadmap report with sites SWG and SCS. So we'll send that out. Their feedback has been tremendously valuable, and we look forward to that. It's been insightful, helpful, and constructive. And then final reviews with NERC leadership and staff will take place in December. And with that, I thank you for your time. Our distribution list for the security integration team is up there on the screen. You are welcome to reach out if you've got questions or comments, concerns. We value your feedback. So with that, thank you very much.